The land looked as if it had been stripped of its memory. Dust wandered where grass should have been, and the wind rattled through the bones of the ranch like a mourner at a graveyard. Elias McGraw reined in his horse at the warped fence line and stared at the thing he had bought for $22, a sum that seemed laughable even to him. But laughter had long dried up in Elias. All he carried now was a slow hunger for a place of his own, even if it was nothing more than rotting boards and barren soil. Some men bought gold, others bought graves. He suspected he had bought both at once. He sat tall in the saddle, though his shoulders bore the quiet curve of shame. Years of wandering, of being called shiftless, of being spat upon by those who measured worth in cattle and coin, those years had carved him into a man who craved no applause. What he wanted was silence, and silence was the only thing the ranch promised in abundance. Yet even silence has a weight, and as he nudged his horse through the broken gate, Elias felt the place watching him. Inside the yard, the house leaned like a drunk who had lost his cane. Shingles had slipped free, leaving bald patches on the roof. The porch groaned when Elias set his boot upon it. He tested the front door, it opened with a sigh, hinges rust-sore. Inside, the air was thick with dust, as though the rooms had held their breath for years. Cobwebs clung like mourning veils, and in the hearth a pile of ash lay gray and brittle, the memory of a fire that had died without witness. Elias walked through the rooms, each step sinking into warped boards. He did not expect comfort. He expected to feel alone, and he did, though not in the way he had anticipated. The loneliness here was different, heavier, as if someone had pressed their despair into the walls and it lingered still. He rubbed his palms together, uneasy. He told himself it was only a house. Yet something in his chest whispered that this place carried a secret, one waiting to be uncovered whether he willed it or not. When the barn door creaked open, the smell struck him first, something metallic, sour, and old. His horse stamped nervously behind him. Elias squinted into the dimness. The slanted light from a high window fell across beams blackened by time. And there, suspended in the hush of the barn, hung a figure. For an instant his heart stopped, and all he saw was the silhouette of death, a body dangling from a rope tied to the loft beam. His throat closed, and instinct drove him backward. Then his eyes adjusted, and he saw her, young, dark-haired, the skin of her arms bruised deep where the rope cut. An Apache girl, scarcely grown, her head slumped forward as though life had been stolen too soon. But then he heard it, a ragged breath, faint as the rustle of dry grass. "God help me," Elias muttered, stumbling forward. His knife shook in his grip as he cut through the coarse rope. The girl's body fell heavy into his arms, almost dragging him down. He laid her gently on the straw, listening for another breath. It came, weak but there. He pressed trembling fingers against her neck. Her pulse flickered like a candle about to gutter. Elias cursed his hesitation, shame bit through him sharper than fear. He had nearly walked away, nearly let her hang because it was easier to believe her already gone. He lifted her carefully, carried her out into the light. Her eyelids twitched but did not open. The marks around her throat were cruel, purple rings that spoke of hatred. He did not ask who had done this. He did not want to know, not yet. The question that mattered was whether she would live. Inside the house he laid her on a narrow bed, brushing dust from the quilt. He fetched water, tipping it slow against her lips. She swallowed with difficulty, her throat working against pain. She did not look at him, though her body stirred faintly under his hand. She clutched at the blanket as if it were a shield, refusing the comfort he tried to offer. Elias sat on the edge of the bed, his breath uneven. This was no bargain he had meant to make. He had come for solitude and found instead a fragile life thrust into his keeping. The ranch had not sold him land alone, it had sold him a secret, a burden, and perhaps a test of his own soul. Night closed in quick as a shutter. He lit a lantern, the flame painting the walls with weary gold. The girl lay still, though her breathing steadied some. Elias dozed in the chair by the bed, his hat tipped low, his thoughts restless. What if she died by morning? What if she lived but hated him for touching her? He had no answers, only the weight of choice pressing against his chest. By dawn he resolved to fetch supplies. Leaving her was a risk, but he could not help her with bare cupboards. He saddled his horse and rode into town, where eyes followed him the way hawks follow a dying rabbit. At the general store Martha Bell stood behind the counter, sharp-eyed, her tongue always ready for a tale. She watched Elias with interest, her voice pitched low. "Here you bought yourself a ranch, McGraw. Some say it's cursed. Some say it ought to have been burned clean. What say you?" Elias kept his words clipped, buying flour, beans, and bandages. But Martha leaned forward, squinting. "Funny thing, folks whisper you've got company out there. Some kind of secret." He ignored her, though shame tightened his throat. As he left, he passed Sheriff Amos Cutter, a man with a jaw like carved stone. Cutter's eyes narrowed. "Word to the wise, Elias. Town won't stomach you harboring the wrong sort. Best keep your affairs in order." Elias said nothing. The warning followed him all the way back across the plain, a shadow heavier than his saddlebags. When he returned, the girl was awake. She sat propped against the wall, eyes black as river stones, watching him enter. She did not flinch, did not thank him, only observed with the wary patience of a creature cornered. He set the supplies down, trying to appear steady though his heart rattled in his ribs. The silence stretched until night again draped itself over the house. Elias sat by the lantern, the girl's breath faint beneath the blanket. He wondered what name she carried, what grief. He wondered why fate had chosen him to witness her survival. At last she turned her head, her voice rough from the rope's cruelty. She spoke a single word, quiet but edged with demand. "Why?" The question struck through him sharper than any blade. He had no answer, only the knowledge that her eyes would not release him, and that the life he had bought for $22 had become something he could neither measure nor escape. And in that moment, the silence of the ranch was no longer his. It belonged to her. The days that followed moved slow, like dust drifting in a shaft of light. The girl, Naya, as he came to know when she whispered her name in a rasp, kept mostly silent, her eyes wary, her body still thin with weakness. Elias McGraw did not press her. He learned her moods by the tilt of her head, the way her fingers tightened around the cup when he brought her water, the way she turned her gaze to the window as though the horizon might deliver her freedom. He tended the barn and mended fences, each swing of the hammer a rhythm that calmed him, though he never forgot the slight sound of her breathing within the house. When he left meals on the table, she would wait until he had stepped away before touching them. At night, he sometimes found the blanket he had placed on her folded neatly, as if to remind him she owed him nothing. Yet one evening, when his shirt tore at the shoulder while he split wood, he laid it aside by the chair. By morning it was mended with uneven stitches. Elias touched the seam with his calloused fingers, a warmth rising in him that startled more than pleased. It was not gratitude spoken aloud, but it was something truer, a sign of a life refusing to be reduced to victimhood. Still, the town pressed closer with its whispers. Elias knew it every time he rode in for flour or kerosene. Martha Bell's eyes gleamed sharper, her words laced with suspicion. "Saw a shadow in your window, Elias. Thought you wanted that ranch for peace. Funny kind of peace, keeping a savage under your roof." Others muttered behind their hands, and laughter cut at his back like a whip. Shame crawled under his skin, old and familiar, but now weighted with fear for the girl. Sheriff Amos Cutter came by one afternoon, riding slow up the path with the dust swirling behind his horse. He dismounted, his boots thudding against the porch. "McGraw," he said, voice heavy as iron. "I'll be plain. The town won't stand for you keeping her. Folks see it as trouble. If she runs. If she runs, if she steals, if anything happens, they'll say it was you who brought it on." Elias met his gaze, his jaw tight. "She's no thief. She's just breathing, same as the rest of us. Cutter studied him a long moment, then spat in the dirt. Breathing can be enough to set this town off. You do well to remember. He mounted and rode away, leaving Elias with the knowledge that silence would no longer protect them. That night the wind carried the smell of rain. Naya sat near the lantern, her eyes following the flame as if it spoke in a language only she understood. Elias wanted to ask her why she had been left to hang, who had bound the rope, what she carried inside her silence. But he did not. Instead, he slid the plate of beans toward her. She accepted it without looking at him, though she placed half back on the table when she was done, as though to share. A gesture small, yet it pressed against the walls of his chest until he had to steady his breath. It was not long before trouble came in the shape of Jed Nolan, a drifter who smelled of whiskey and dust, his grin sharp with cruelty. He rode into town, boasting in the saloon of the fool who had bought a ghost ranch. When he learned of the Apache girl hidden there, his laughter was louder than the piano. McGraw keeping himself a prize, should have known he'd need to buy company since no decent soul would have him. The words carried quick, as they always did, and by the time Elias walked into town for nails and rope, Jed was waiting outside the store, his eyes gleaming with malice. You playing house with a savage, McGraw? Jed sneered loud enough for others to hear. Guess beggars can't be choosers. The sting of mockery was not new, but Naya hearing of it was. Elias clenched his fists but did not strike. He let the words fall like stones he refused to pick up. The onlookers muttered, some amused, others uneasy. His silence was an act of endurance, but it left him burning inside, knowing the insult would find its way back to her. That evening, Naya's gaze was sharper, her lips pressed tight. She had overheard, he saw it in her eyes. He wanted to tell her she was not a burden, not a shame. But words would be lies until he proved them. He could only keep tending the fences, keep setting bread by her plate, keep waiting for the moment she might see him not as captor nor savior, but as man. The storm broke a few nights later. Elias woke to the sound of boots crunching on gravel, then the crash of the barn door thrown wide. He seized his rifle, heart hammering. In the lantern's glow he saw Jed Nolan, drunk, staggering but dangerous. He had Naya by the wrist, her face twisted in silent fury as she tried to pull away. Found your treasure, McGraw, Jed slurred. Thought I'd take her for myself. No sense wasting her on a coward. Elias's voice was low, ragged. Let her go. Jed laughed, a cruel sound. You couldn't keep a mule tied, let alone a girl. He shoved Naya, and she stumbled, catching herself against a beam. Elias charged, rifle raised not to shoot but to strike. The two men collided, the barn filling with the sounds of fists, wood, and breathless grunts. Jed's strength was fueled by liquor, wild and reckless. Elias fought with desperation, every blow carrying the shame of years, the need to protect what little had been entrusted to him. The fight spilled into the straw, dust rising, horses stamping in panic. Jed pinned Elias, snarling, his hands closing around Elias's throat. For a moment the world narrowed to the dark edge of suffocation. Then a crash split the air. Naya, her hands trembling but fierce, had lifted a lantern and struck Jed across the shoulder. Glass shattered, flames licking at the straw. Jed cried out, stumbling back, clutching at the fire crawling up his sleeve. He bolted into the night, cursing, his figure swallowed by darkness. The barn hissed with sparks, smoke curling upward. Elias dragged water, beating the flames down until the danger was smothered. He stood panting, soot on his face, while Naya knelt nearby, her chest heaving, eyes wide. For the first time, she looked at him without distrust. Not gratitude, not surrender, something deeper. Recognition. As though in that moment, in the glow of smoldering embers, they both understood the fragile bond forged in survival. The following day the town was silent, for word had spread. No one laughed now. Some stared with unease, others with grudging respect. Sheriff Cutter rode out once more, studied the blackened patch of straw, the weary line of Elias's shoulders, the unflinching gaze of the girl beside him. "You saved her," Cutter said finally. "That counts, even if folks don't say it." Then he tipped his hat and left. The ranch stood battered but not broken. Elias and Naya moved about it like two survivors of the same storm, their silence no longer hostile but shared. When he mended the fence, she carried nails. When she drew water, he held the bucket steady. Their gestures were small, wordless, yet each one carried the weight of trust being built slowly, like stones in a wall. One evening as the sun bled red over the horizon, Elias sat on the porch, weary but steadied by the sight of her seated nearby, her hair loose, her face turned toward the dying light. He thought of how he had bought this place for $22, expecting nothing but ruin. Instead he had been given a burden, and through it, a kind of grace he had never sought. The cicadas hummed, the land breathed, and in the quiet she looked at him. No question this time, no why. Just a gaze that said enough. And as the night came on, Elias felt the truth settle into him. Some lives are not purchased but entrusted, and what we do with them is what tells the world who we are. His silence was an act of endurance, but it left him burning inside, knowing the insult would find its way back to her. That evening, Naya's gaze was sharper, her lips pressed tight. She had overheard, he saw it in her eyes. He wanted to tell her she was not a burden, not a shame. But words would be lies until he proved them. He could only keep tending the fences, keep setting bread by her plate, keep waiting for the moment she might see him not as captor nor savior, but as man. The storm broke a few nights later. Elias woke to the sound of boots crunching on gravel, then the crash of the barn door thrown wide. He seized his rifle, heart hammering. In the lantern's glow he saw Jed Nolan, drunk, staggering but dangerous. He had Naya by the wrist, her face twisted in silent fury as she tried to pull away. "Found your treasure, McGraw," Jed slurred. "Thought I'd take her for myself. No sense wasting her on a coward." Elias's voice was low, ragged. "Let her go." Jed laughed, a cruel sound. You couldn't keep a mule tied, let alone a girl." He shoved Naya, and she stumbled, catching herself against a beam. Elias charged, rifle raised not to shoot but to strike. The two men collided, the barn filling with the sounds of fists, wood, and breathless grunts. Jed's strength was fueled by liquor, wild and reckless. Elias fought with desperation, every blow carrying the shame of years, the need to protect what little had been entrusted to him. The fight spilled into the straw, dust rising, horses stamping in panic. Jed pinned Elias, snarling, his hands closing around Elias's throat. For a moment the world narrowed to the dark edge of suffocation. Then a crash split the air. Naya, her hands trembling but fierce, had lifted a lantern and struck Jed across the shoulder. Glass shattered, flames licking at the straw. Jed cried out, stumbling back, clutching at the fire crawling up his sleeve. He bolted into the night, cursing, his figure swallowed by darkness. The barn high.